Hello and welcome to today's conversation. So I'm Rohini Rathore and I've got with me Lara Matthai. And together we're going to be talking about adversity and, dealing with adversity and how you can thrive even through adversity. So before we kind of really kick off and talk through our structure, I want to invite Lara to maybe give her, a perspective on what she thinks adversity means.
Thank you, Rohini. So I always think of Holtz when I think of adversity. He has this quote which says, show me someone who has done something worthwhile, and I will show you someone who has faced adversity. And I think it just goes to the heart of the very essence of life and the very essence of striving and reaching for something that you really want, or the very existence of life is one where we face adversity. And to me, it's a bit around the continued difficulty of a problem. So not something that comes and goes, not something that perhaps even money can fix or good advice can change. Because I think life's most serious difficulties are very often ones that you have to go through, whether it's watching a loved one suffer through cancer, or whether you live in a marriage that doesn't work, or watching your child with low self-esteem. These are prolonged difficulties that offer you the opportunity to sort of step into courage. And that defines adversity. And that's sort of the thin line between adversity and trauma, like differentiating those two, because adversity comes to you as a setback and a problem, but it also offers you that space to step into your own courage to face it.
Yeah, gosh, I love that. And I think, we were talking about this earlier, that adversity is really in a spectrum, and if I think about adversity very simply, adversity comes from the word adverse, which means something different to what you expected. And that we see that all the time, these days, even somebody posting a rude comment or somebody saying something in a tone that you take as, offensive can feel like an adversity. And we're immediately then through our subconscious, going to react in a certain way. So I think what you're saying and what a lot of people would agree is that it's through adversity that we really grow. Because if you're in a very comfortable place where everything's predictable, then it's a bit boring, but also you don't learn anything new. So I think that's a good reason to embrace adversity. So what I would like to do is maybe just talk through very simply how today's conversation is going to flow. So we have a few slides, they're quite visual and they will hopefully help you, retain some of the points we're going to talk about. And we're not going to talk about the topic in a huge amount of detail because we only have 20 minutes. So we're going to pick on the things that we think are most interesting to us and most relevant to you. And so there's going to be a mix and match of a few slides with free-flowing conversation. So with that, I'm going to share a screen and God willing, it will appear. Yes, it has. Thank you, God. So I'm going to now just play this. So we're talking about thriving through adversity, and the typical responses to adversity you will hear is flight or fight. So the first one is fight, where obviously if something is really, really provoking you, you're going to push back. That's a very normal response. Or you're going to run away because it feels too scary and you feel like you need to get away from that situation as soon as possible. Now, there are two other responses that Lara and I really want to talk about today, which maybe are, less frequently talked about and perhaps even less, considered, but they happen all the time. So the third one is to freeze. When something happens and you suddenly don't have a response and you're rooted to the spot and you don't know how to respond, or maybe you're thinking about what the best response is, or you're just frozen, not knowing what to do. And the final one is to flow. So again, we're going to talk through a little bit about what this could mean, because even though those four responses sound pretty clear cut, they're not necessarily clear cut, and there's lots of shades of gray. It's not black and white. So I'm going to stop share for a second, and I'm going to invite Lara to maybe just give her thoughts on those four responses.
Yeah, absolutely. I think most of us we almost fear these adverse situations, right? So like you said, I think fight, flight, freeze are very common. and we use all these different kinds of ways to escape, to run away from it, or to soften it, or to numb it, and sometimes even just refuse to acknowledge it by living in denial. And if you think about it, all addictions stem from this exact behavior, where when we meet our challenge eye to eye, we just can't face it. So we need to mask it, or we feel the need to mask it with anything, and we become addicted to anything that seems to ease that pain.
Yeah.
So that's how, sort of, when I look at it, I can see that in each response. And I loved what you said about the shades of it, because there's so many different shades of how that can play out.
So let's look at a sort of real life example. I mean, you coach lots of executives, in your work and maybe outside of work as well. What's been, if you were to think about a classic, situation where you might consider one of these four responses, can you give us an example?
Yeah. Let me use a very simplistic example for this. So let's say you have a very difficult boss and you feel tremendously overworked, sometimes harassed. And, on a weekend, this person shows up and just gives you a lot of unexpected work, and you're sort of fed up of it. So one weekend, you might be in fight mode and you might say, I did this extra work last weekend, or why should I do this? Could you give it to the other team member? You're trying to defend, you're trying to deflect, and you're trying to push this away. When you are in flight mode, it could mean that you're making excuses like, oh my gosh, I'm so busy this weekend. My mom is coming. I have, I feel sick. So you're just trying to avoid the situation and avoid that conversation itself. If you are in freeze, it could be, you say nothing, or even worse, you nod and you agree at the moment. And then you're kicking yourself later because you're feeling like you let yourself down. And flow could be addressing the problem head on. So it could be, maybe you take it on that weekend, but then you want to nip it in the bud, not just this weekend, but longer term. So you actually address it and you say, okay, manager, I noticed that you are giving me a lot more work than I should be doing, and I would like to talk to you about this. So that could be one way that you could address it. But there are lots of shades of how this plays out. So what I shared is a bit simplistic.
Yeah, but it's a good way to frame it. And I think, within that, it's like a blank canvas. You have the outline and then people can fill in whatever colors they want. And I think I really I want to invite people to think about different kinds of martial art. There's obviously I'm not a martial art expert, I'm going to warn you, but I know enough about the different kinds. So there's obviously something like karate, which is very resistance. It's about strength and resisting. So it's almost like when you think about fight, you're in mode of resisting somebody trying to make you do something and maybe fighting back. Whereas there's another kind of martial art, which is Tai Chi, where you kind of use the other person's force to bring them down.
Yeah.
So I think even in fight, there are many different ways of doing it. But I think the key is to actually to use that freeze more positively, because I think maybe people often when they think about freeze, it's seen as a bad thing. Like, you paused and you were inactive. But in that inactivity or in that pause, you have an opportunity to take yourself outside of the situation, almost dispassionately, look at it from a helicopter view. Look at it from their perspective. Look at it from the perspective of somebody who's completely not connected to either of you, and see what's really going on here. How much of what I'm perceiving is in my head and how much is really going on, and use that to then decide what's the right response. It could be fight, it could be flight, it could be flowing. So even with flowing, your example was beautiful, where you actually constructively create a flow that works for both of you and you achieve the outcome without feeling like you've been taken advantage of.
Yeah.
But sometimes flow can work where you just allow yourself to go with someone else's flow, like you become a
Go in the
doormat
moment.
effectively.
Yeah.
And you lose your own sense of identity, your own sense of boundaries, and that's not good either. So you end up being overworked and you can end up feeling quite resentful, and that's not a good feeling. So I think we've set the scene in terms of what there are possible, how we can possibly look at it. So I'm going to go back to my presentation, and we're going to explore some other ways of thinking about the right responses. So we talked about these four responses, but there's a process for us each to become a bit more aware of how we can make the right decision. So there's 7 of these steps, and I'm not intending to go through each one in detail. The first one is perspective, which I just touched on, where you really look at what's going on, not just for you, but also for the other person, get the big picture. The second is the scope. Is this really a massive problem, or is it a molehill that you've turned into a mountain in your own head? Thirdly is presence. Can you use that freeze moment, or just, be more mindful of what's actually going on, and how you're reacting, whether it's coming from something that's been your experience rather than what's actually going on. And responding and not reacting, because reacting happens immediately, comes from a place of your subconscious experiences and your past learned experiences. Befriend your fears. I think, Lara, you said something earlier about when you're talking about adversity, step into your courage. I love that. And I think it's really facing your fears and realizing that your fears are there to protect you. They're not there to make your life miserable. Although if you don't listen to them, you don't befriend them, they can feel like they're just constantly nagging you. Finding purpose. I think this is my favorite one. And, we've done a separate conversation with Shweta and Saloni on purpose. So we won't talk too much about that. And finally, it's, the difference between being optimistic and being rooted in realism. So I think that's 7 steps, and there's probably many more. So Lara, I invite you to pick 2 of your favorites or one of your favorites, depending on how much time you've got, I think. And then we can maybe just, wrap up once we've done that.
Sure. So I think there are 2 that I could speak to a little bit. So one is I think it's the first and the last, right? Almost like bookends. So one is around perspective. So for perspective, I think the perspective that we all have tends to be the story we're telling ourselves in our head. I come from a marketing background, so I realize that, how you define the world and how you see what happens at every stage, and the story you narrate has a big influence on how then you choose to respond, to react, to actually face or not face a situation. So a perspective could be that if we know that to accomplish anything in life, we will come face to face with adversity. I think we all know this. But if we went through life with a lens which says, problems are expected, but they're never permanent. And also that typically what stops us and blocks us, it also empowers us. So sort of accepting that they're a part of life, they're a healthy exposure to these problems helps us to exercise that courage and grow, is sort of my, tip on perspective. And the other one is around the 7th point you have there in terms of being rooted in realism. So I think if there's one thing that, I would really offer folks to take out of this talk, it would be this, that in adversity, and envisioning the positive and the negative are really necessary. And I'll tell you why. Because when we focus on positive thoughts about the future, we sort of paint a picture, an illusion that we will someday walk into that success, walk into that space. But if we only focus on the positive, then we trick our minds into believing that we may not have to actually put in the effort and face the hurdles needed to get there. Similarly, with negative thoughts, they make you believe, if you only focus on the negative, they make you believe that you've already lost. So there is no need to put in the effort to achieve it. So it's the exact same thing, but on 2 different sides. So I think the main takeaway is which I would offer is to visualize both, and we must visualize both. We start to then become aware of this quality of persistence, because through persistence, we can chase our big goals and our hopes and our dreams, but we anticipate the challenges and the setbacks, and we can pick up and dust ourselves off and keep going. So these would be the 2 that I think, have really helped me in my life.
Yeah, I think that those are 2 great pieces of, advice and tools to have in our sort of armory, I suppose. I think if I was to pick 2 of my favorites, the first one is probably presence, because presence gives you the ability to be in the moment and really take in fresh information, because our brains have got so much information stuffed, from what we've learned, what we've read, sometimes experiences that are not even our own. We've looked at other people's
Mm,
experiences and we've colored our experience
yeah,
with that. So to be able to almost kind of, for a little while, just disregard all of that and look at this fresh information and make a decision on the basis of that is really important. And I think the other one is finding purpose, and this is particularly true of when you're going through some really dark adversity, where it almost feels like you have no reason to go on.
mm,
Like, what's the point? What is the point of
yeah,
even continuing to live or continuing to wake up in the morning? And that's when, if you can find a reason to go on. It could be somebody who relies on you. In our case, it's our children. Our children depend on us. It could be somebody who's elderly who also relies on you. But very often it can be somebody external to you. It doesn't even have to be within your immediate family. So purpose is about finding
yeah,
something that's bigger than us, to
yeah,
feel that our presence in this world will make a difference to them, which will keep us going. So I think those are my two ones. And I think if we were to look at the current situation of COVID and how hopeless sometimes it can feel, like just when you think things are now getting better, they go bad again. And I think, to your point, which about keeping faith rooted in realism, is also one I think is often missed, because people think that positive thinkers, those who look on the bright side, who are optimists, are the ones who will win through any
mm,
kind of dark times. But what they forget is that, imagine there's a long tunnel that we're all going through, and you can see this pinprick of a light. So you think, yeah, yeah, we're coming to the end of it. But there's an optical illusion. You can't really know how far that light is. So if you're an
yeah,
optimist, you're going to say, right, we're going to reach that light in 3 days, right? And you believe in that so much that when it comes to the third day and you still realize the light is still far away, your heart breaks a little bit. And then you say, okay, it's another 3 days. And so you kind of create these artificial goalposts, which
yeah,
then don't get met. Whereas if you're a realistic person, you might say, okay, there's a light there, but I have no idea when we're going to reach it. But
yeah,
all I care is that the light is there and that we will get there. And all I have to do is be present, take each day as it comes, and do what I
yeah.
need to do to get past this one day. So I think that's the difference between the two. So I think we have about 3 minutes in which to wrap up. So I want to ask you if you can think of any other sort of example where somebody could use some of these perspectives that we've shared to go and maybe make a slightly different choice. I don't want to say better, but a
Yeah.
different choice to what they might have made before.
I think, there are so many examples because this adversity could be in any part of your life. And what seems like adversity to one person may not seem like adversity to another. I think there's a few myths that perhaps we could bust, right? Because if it is difficult and challenging and puts you in a vulnerable place and asks you to step into a place of courage, then it is your personal adversity.
Yeah.
And the important thing to realize is there is no right or wrong emotion. The lesson is in almost allowing that emotion, even a negative one, and curiously, like a child, almost dig deeper to understand what role is that emotion playing. Because I think you were saying it, Rohini, or India, I thought I heard you talk about the negative emotions, right? So they also protect us, they also play a role. And that freeze that you spoke about, right? It might actually be the pause that you need to then step up and look around. And the
Yeah.
problem, I think, arises when we avoid acknowledging or being present, like you said about presence. We avoid being present with the adversity, and that causes us to miss out on some great lessons that we can learn in life.
Yeah, that's so powerful, because I think, where there is a temptation to always be positive and optimistic, and that
Yeah,
sometimes makes us blind to
yeah,
adversity that is either looming right in front of us or is on its way.
yeah.
And I think to be mindful of that and actually allow, place for sadness. I mean, that film, oh God, what was that film of a Disney film about emotions?
Yeah, Inside Out, was it?
Inside Out,
Is it
thank you.
called?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's such, I mean, it's a children's film, but with
Yeah,
such profoundly adult themes. And I think if people haven't watched it, please go and watch it, because all these different emotions, as you said, have a role to play. And if you don't acknowledge them, if you don't give them the space to be processed, then that can have its own problems in terms of physical illness, mental illness.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's finding balance at the end of the day. So I think I'm just going to give my final two pennies worth, and then I'll ask Lara to make her closing comments. So I think adversity is here to stay. And actually, if you welcome adversity and see it as an opportunity to learn and grow and become somebody, you know, perhaps that you are destined to be, then you will deal with it in a very different way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, just summarizing that, expect the problems along the way, but to remember they're not permanent. And then also to look at those problems as perhaps, what impedes us will also empower us, and to step into that space and to try and, keep your persistence with trying, failing, but ultimately, I think always succeeding.
Love it. Thank you so much, Lara. I really enjoyed our conversation, and thank you for
Likewise.
watching, everybody, and good luck. And if there's anything you want to share in terms of feedback, or you want to get in touch with us, you know where to find us. Thank you, and bye-bye.
Bye.